Welcome back to Supreme Myths. We have been on a little bit of a hiatus in April, but we are back for a fun-filled May. May is going to be history, tradition, originalism month here at Supreme Myths. And we begin it today with Arnold Stephen Jacobs Jr., who we're going to call AJ. And AJ is an author. He's also an editor for Esquire magazine. He's written a book called The Year of Living Biblically, but that was a while back. His sequel to that book is called, and this is why he's here, The Year of Living Constitutionally. And basically, it's the year of living like an originalist, I think. AJ, welcome to the podcast.
I am so delighted to be here. Yes, that's exactly what it is, the year of living as an originalist. But I also want to start with some gratitude because while researching this book, I listened to hours of your podcast.
Oh, well, thank you.
And I read your books and I interviewed you. So you are a big influence on my thinking. So I want to thank you right up front.
And the people who understand if that's true, then we know what AJ is going to say about originalism. But anyway.
You were an influence in that I rejected everything you said.
AJ is not a lawyer, but he is someone. If you read this book, again, The Year of Living Constitutionally, it's available everywhere. If you read this book, you will know that you will find out he knows a lot about law and a lot about originalism, it turns out. So let's begin with this. You have a wife and 2 kids? 1 kid?
That's true. Yeah, 3 actually.
Wife and 3 kids. Me too. I have 3 daughters. Okay, wife and 3 kids. When you told them, like, you were going to do this, live a year as an originalist, live a year as if it's 1791, what was their reaction?
Not happy. Not happy. My wife said right up front, I'm not churning any butter. They have been through this before because that, as a writer, that is what I like to do. I'd like to immerse myself in these projects. And you mentioned one where I lived by all the rules of the Bible. And that actually my wife hated more because I had a huge beard and I couldn't touch her during certain times of the month. So that one was a little even more difficult. But I will say, just because I'm a believer in balance, there were parts of this that she did love. And she even got into it a little and wore the bonnet a few times.
We're going to get into bonnet and churning butter and all kinds of things back from 1791. I do want to ask you about the first book, Living Biblically, just quickly, and then we'll get into the year of living as an originalist. How did you pick and choose which parts of the Bible to follow and which parts of the Bible not to follow? Because I'm assuming you didn't stone any children or sell them off as slavery.
No, well, I didn't send them off to slavery, but I did stone adulterers. The whole point was no picking and choosing. I tried to become the ultimate originalist for this book. I tried to be the ultimate fundamentalist and follow everything in the Bible. So from the 10 Commandments, the famous ones, but also the Old Testament says you cannot wear clothes made of 2 different kinds of fabric. So got rid of all of my polycotton blends. And I stone an adulterer. I used very small stones, pebbles, so that was more, I don't know if I'd follow the spirit, but I did follow the letter of the law. And so a lot of that book is very relevant to this because it was about how do we interpret this ancient document? How much do we evolve the meaning? How much is it fixed in the past?
And of course, people know when I took on the academic task of describing originalism, I decided to write a book called Originalism as Faith because of the great similarities between how literalists look at the Bible and how some modern day originalists claim they look at the Constitution. And we'll get into that in a second. Okay, so when you began the year of living constitutionally, how did you start? How did you begin to learn about, I want to know what went into the research. I know I talked to you for a little while, of course, but what went into the research of the book?
Oh, well, it was, first of all, the publisher wanted it out before the election because they felt it was very timely. So I really had a year to learn to take myself through law school and also wear my tricorn hat and carry my musket and write pamphlets with a quill pen, all the things that I tried to do like our founders.
Let's talk about muskets before I forget.
Okay.
So did you learn how to shoot a musket?
I did indeed. I did indeed.
Yes.
Yeah, because the premise of the book is I'm going to express my rights using the mindset and technology from the 18th century when the Constitution was written, so that I don't have any hubris in assuming what the founders might have approved or disapproved. Go back to the source. So I went on ye olde.
Well, hold on. I'm sorry. I must interrupt you there because you know what I'm going to say. Um, you might think you're doing that, but recreating exactly how they were doing it and what they were doing and why is one of the problems I think you learned doing this book. Go on. I'm
Exactly.
sorry.
That was
I'm sorry.
right. That was a
Yes.
big takeaway. It is impossible.
Yes.
But I
Yes.
tried, and I got a musket, an actual 1700s musket off of ye old internet, and I bore it around New York City on the Upper West Side where I live, and I got some very mixed reactions. People would cross the street to avoid me. It did come in handy once where I went to a coffee shop, and a guy arrived at the same time as me, and he said, "You go first. I am not going to fight." So
Did you did you have a license for this musket?
no, but
Do we need a license for muskets? You would
according
think
to
I
my
would know that, but
research, yeah, well, I'd be interested. The lawyers can tell me, but my research indicates if it's not loaded, it is an antique. As once you put lead
ah
balls in it and gunpowder, and I did go to a shooting range and shoot at 18th century style, which was also very revelatory because it is not easy. It's like building an IKEA table. It is like 15 steps. You have to load it, you take the ramrod out, put the ramrod in. So it's a very different machine. And try to
you put the
imagine.
ramrod in, you put the ramrod out, you put the ramrod,
You
you
could,
shake it all.
that is it. Exactly. You can sing the song too if you want.
That's the first time I've ever sung on this podcast, and it'll be the last time I've ever sung on this podcast. Go ahead.
Uh, but yes, so that was another.
Well, let's talk about that for a second.
Okay.
I want to talk about that for a second.
Yes.
So we can do all the historical research we want, and frankly, I have about the differences between muskets and AR-15s.
Right.
But I would think the best way to really understand the difference is to try to shoot a musket. And your description of the book is priceless, and it's wonderful. Explain how hard it was.
Yeah, it is. So it is at least 15 steps as we were taking the ramrod and putting the. It took me at least 2 minutes to fire one shot. According to historians, the Revolutionary War soldiers could do 3 or 4 shots per minute, but still, compared to an AR-15 where you're just pulling the trigger, dozens of shots per minute, it is an amazingly different machine. You would have a lot of trouble doing a mass shooting with a musket. And that was one of the big, it was one of the big topics that I explored. At what point is technology so different that the same law does not apply? Is it like where you have a law that says bicycles are allowed on this street, or I'm sorry, a law that says wheeled vehicles are allowed on the street when there were only bicycles, and now we have Mack trucks? Do we need to change the law?
And by the way, you are identifying because you're really good at this, especially for a non-lawyer. And that's one of the reasons I want to talk to you, by the way, because I'm always interested in what very intelligent, politics-aware people think about originalism the first time they come to it, or when they haven't spent their lives dealing with it. And you just put your finger on, to be serious for 1 second, one of the hardest problems, if not the hardest problem of constitutional law. What do you do with a fixed document that you can't change for all intents and purposes, that has imprecise language in it applied to a changing society? That is the central question of constitutional law. What do we do? How do we make those changes? What should judges do it? Should the people, et cetera, et cetera? And I think you saw that by trying to fire this ridiculous ancient weapon that has nothing to do with a modern handgun.
Right. And it also goes the other way, though. When you have a phrase like equal protection,
Yes.
do you just keep the morals of the 18th century, or in that case, the 19th century? Or do you realize morals have evolved and gay marriage is a right and that equal protection should apply to that? So depending on what side of the aisle you're on, you will either view it narrowly or broadly.
Yeah. Actually, it depends on what issue it is, not which side of the
You're right.
aisle
You're
you're
right.
on.
You're right.
That's okay. So you dragged your wife to a lot of different things in this book, which is fun, including, I think, a battle, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I'm assuming in your quest to live as much as practically possible as a 1791 male, you did not bring into your marriage or your parenting a whole lot of 1791 stuff. Or if you did, you didn't go through much of that in the book because I'm assuming your family wouldn't put up with it.
Yes, I certainly kept it to a minimum, but I did try. For instance, the if you are a super strict originalist, and I believe Clarence Thomas has said this, and Antonin Scalia said that the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection, was written without women or sex discrimination or gender discrimination in mind. They were not thinking about that, or certainly not gay discrimination. So if I am going to try to follow the original meaning, then maybe these laws from the 1800s, these sexist laws, they are still constitutional. And maybe if we go back to ultra originalism, we might go back to those laws, as we've seen. So there were lots of laws about married women don't have the right to sign a contract.
Right.
So my
coverture. We call that coverture.
Yes,
in
it was
our
coverture. Exactly. Treating women basically like children. And my wife owns a company, an events company. She writes several contracts a day. And I was like, well, if I'm going to be doing this, maybe I should take over the contracts. She said, be my guest. It's the nightmare. And I tried. It was a disaster. She fired me after an hour. But that was an example of me trying to put in place coverture, and it was just a huge failure. And I do not relish doing that ever again.
I think you did well to throughout the book you make passing reference to the problem of 1791 views about women being transplanted to today, but there's a real serious point to be made there, which is originalists today don't really take into account what women thought, believed, said, or wrote because they were not part of the population that mattered legally back then. And that's, of course, a very serious point. But getting back to the humor of this, I was thinking about you actually yesterday when a friend of mine told me at lunch that he went to the Supreme Court of England.
Oh.
And yes, in Westminster Abbey. And he was shocked around there, and he was shocked that basically you walk in, you sit there, you're free access. It is absolutely nothing like our current modern Supreme Court in America.
Right.
You went to a Supreme Court argument, and I thought that part of your book was funny and interesting. Why don't you tell us about that experience?
Well, that was very much informed by your books and your podcast. So I had a lot of Supreme Court skepticism. I will say it's a complicated issue. So in some senses, when I'm sitting in there, I did have this sense of awe, like this is where Brown v. Board of Education, this is where Obergefell happened, like wow. But on the other hand, they made me wait. I had to get in the line at 3 a.m. and it was an obscure case about identity theft, so it wasn't a blockbuster, but I still had to get there early. And just the physical building I found over the top.
You think?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like a Roman temple where we should be sacrificing oxen to John Roberts, and this is not what the founders wanted. This is a very unoriginalist view because, as you've written, the Supreme Court was not first among equals. It was second or third, probably third.
It was the least dangerous branch.
Yeah, allegedly.
Yeah,
and so. It was all William Howard Taft was after he was president. He's like he wanted to elevate the Supreme Court, and so that was his pet project to build this massive Greco-Roman temple using marble that he got from Mussolini. So that's a little hint of what went wrong. So yeah, I found it over the top
and not very originalist because the original Supreme Court was housed in the basement of some government building someplace.
Right. Well, I think the very first Supreme Court was in a marketplace, like the second floor of a marketplace, and they had to clear the
Yeah.
butchers out because they were making too much noise. So it was very humble. And yeah, now it's like yeah, a Buckingham Palace.
And I do think it's well, I refer to it, as you know, as a marble palace on a hill. Um, if people haven't been there, it is worth stressing how imposing this building is for 9 people. All right, maybe it's 9 people plus their staff and all that stuff, but still, it is a huge building that essentially houses 9. It's kind of a bizarre thing. Okay, you have a little bit in the book about John Marshall, boarding houses, and drinking. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, I in that chapter I go over the history of the Supreme
Yes.
Court, which much of it comes from you. But in the John Marshall era, it was sort of like a very highbrow fraternity. They all lived together in a boarding house, and they drank together. And John Marshall was actually very pro drinking. He had this rule that it was okay to drink when you're deliberating as long as it was raining outside. So they would open the curtain and it would be sunny. And he says, well, our jurisdiction is so large, it's probably raining somewhere in the United States. And then they'd break out the Madeira. So he was very good at the loopholes. Um, I think, imagine if they all had to live together now. I don't know whether that would be good or
I
bad.
like that idea. I
Yeah?
would love to put them all in a house and say, "Don't come out until you agree on." That I would. Actually, Scalia and Kennedy, I believe, are neighbor were neighbors in
Oh,
Virginia.
interesting.
Legend has it. Legend has it. It's funny, what I'm about to describe to you happened in uh, uh, 1992, and we don't even know if it happened. Like, I'm about to tell you a story that I've heard from many people,
Oh,
but
so
I can't
interesting.
even verify
Right.
this from 1992, much less what they were doing. But allegedly, after Casey came out and reaffirmed Roe versus Wade in part, and after Justice Kennedy had voted to overturn Roe 3 years earlier, but then changed his mind after the votes were there to do it, Scalia went to his house and yelled at him, like screamed at him through the window.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, that's what I've heard. I've heard it from numerous sources. Now, I cannot find a documented source I'm willing to put out there on it, but I have heard this, which would have been a very 18th century way of handling this.
Exactly. At least he
Right?
didn't
Didn't
cane
Tom? I
him.
could. Right. I mean, right. I mean, I could see John Adams screaming at Thomas Jefferson, "Get the damn thing written!"
Exactly.
Um, so you went to a. I didn't really understand this. I don't understand this completely. So in the South, of course, as you know, we have Civil War reenactments all the time, and not all the time, but it is a big deal, and people take it unconscionably seriously for reasons that are beyond my intelligence to figure out. You went to a Revolutionary War enactment, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a big deal. There are dozens of battles that they reenact, and they put on their tricorn hats, they take their muskets, they put the whole thing on. And I joined the New Jersey 3rd Regiment. And I have to say, like you, I was skeptical. Why would people do this? But I do think it's complicated. There are positives to it. A lot of the people I talked to were very thoughtful. And one said, he read a book about the Revolutionary War and the sacrifice that these soldiers they were so hungry, they were eating squirrels, and it was just, he wanted to pay homage to them. And I would say the good parts are, first of all, you appreciate what we have now. I mean, we have a ton of problems now, but let's not have this false nostalgia for the past, like Make America Great Again, because it was horrible. Life was horrible. It was sexist, violent, smelly, even something like putting on socks. I tried to put on socks every morning. 18, I've never been so grateful for elastic. Elastic.
It's funny you say that. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's funny you say putting on socks. In high school, I was doing some theater, and I was in the Crucible, and I had to wear tights from those days or whatever. and it was horrific. And I felt like I was suffocating, and it took 30 minutes to get
Yeah.
them over my high school body.
There you go. Exactly. Did you have to wear it guarded? Did you have to? I had to wear these little sock belts. So the amount of time I put on sock
Yes.
belts every morning. So
Yes.
yeah, it was instructive. Well, on the other hand, it was a very DIY culture, and I feel we are alienated from our material culture now. So making a quill pen was actually something that was very satisfying, and writing with a quill. I loved writing with a quill because I was off the internet completely. There were no dings or pings, and it changed the way I thought. I think I was more of a subtle thinker when I was writing with a quill. So that it had its positives as well as its negatives.
I'm fairly confident. I say this with this prediction with lots of confidence. If I tried to use a quill pen, I would end up with just pen all over my clothes. That's what would happen to me.
Well,
I
yes,
would just
I think it's a fair because I did. I mean, it's literally an ink stained dretch. I was actually doing some this morning. I don't know if you can still see the ink on my
yeah,
fingers,
yeah, yeah.
but yeah.
All right. I want to talk about. I want to talk about two different constitutional questions. One very big that I've written a lot about that you address in the book, and one I've done over 110 podcasts. 90% of those have been with, excuse me, constitutional law professors, and we have talked about a potpourri of constitutional provisions. But one provision we have never talked about. This podcast has never, ever mentioned. In fact, until I read your book, I don't believe, and I was talking to my wife about it, I don't believe I ever said this word out loud until I read your book,
So exciting.
which is Letters of Marque.
That's
Our Constitution talks about letters of marque, and you spent a good amount of time in this book talking about that, and I think that's fabulous. So tell us what. So here you can play con law professor because I have no idea. I had no idea
this
what
was
letters of
so
marque were.
exciting. This is extremely yes. This is in
Yeah.
Article 1, Section 8, where it
By
gives.
the way, you did not ask me about letters of marque when we talked. By the way, go
I
ahead.
know I should have. I should have. Believe me. Well, this to me shows the how different life was because some of the Constitution is still so relevant, but then you have this passage that Congress has the right, has the power to grant citizens I believe it's letters of marque. I could be wrong.
Okay.
I hadn't talked to anyone from the 1700s. Letter of marque and reprisal, which is basically government sanctioned piracy. It's outsourcing. They didn't have much of a navy in the Revolutionary War. So they had to say, all right, you fishermen over here, you put some cannons on your fishing boat, go out, capture a British ship. You get to keep the sherry, the uniforms, any guns they have. You keep the booty. So it was legal piracy. Privateering is the preferred word. So these were privateers. And without privateers, we would not have won the revolution because they captured 2,000 British ships. But it's still in the Constitution. That's what's amazing. It has never been overturned or struck out with an amendment. So I thought, let me be the first one since 1815 to try to get a letter of marque and reprisal. And I actually met with Congressman Ro Khanna from California, and I think he was trying to get me to donate money, but I was trying to get him to grant
That's
me.
all they do. That's the only thing
that
they
is
do.
his job.
Yes.
I like him though.
Yes.
I said, well, I have a request of you, and I gave him my application for a letter of marque and reprisal I'd written with my quill pen. And at first he was very enthusiastic because he didn't know what it was. So he's like, all right, how can we make this happen? And then I told him it was basically I wanted to be a pirate. And then he became a little less enthusiastic. He's like, wait a second. You're going to go to the Taiwan Strip. What's happening here? But he did say he would bring it up with his colleagues. I mean, he liked the premise of my book. He's very into constitutional law. So he liked the idea of exploring it in this unique way. So I did end up emailing with him and his assistant. They started calling me Captain, which was nice. That's the closest I got to being a pirate. But it is fascinating to see that that there are parts of the Constitution that remind you, wait, this is from the 18th century. This is clear.
And if you'll forgive me for this, and you're going to have to. I mean, it is something I need you to forgive me for. I want to make a point about this letter of Marque that actually, or letter of Marque, that I just actually realized. So in our Constitution, there is a provision that allowed, and presumably might even allow today, for Congress to authorize private people to basically act as part of the American military, right? I mean, that's what was going on.
Right.
This was a delegation of power to private people to exercise the military power of the United States, and it went past the Constitution.
Right.
So this is why I bring this up, and again, I apologize for the digression. So several law professors, Josh Blackman and Seth Tillman, have written a brief in a couple of the Trump cases, and Justice Thomas referred to this last week in the oral argument in the immunity case, that Jack Smith, the prosecutor, is unconstitutional. Their position, their separation of powers. Sorry to get all doctrinal.
No, this is great.
Position is Congress is allowed to authorize the executive branch to name an independent prosecutor,
right,
but only if they're a Senate confirmed person already, meaning probably one of the 50 U.S. attorneys in the various states. Whoever it is, it has to be a U.S. confirmed person. There is no basis in text or history for that bizarre argument. But this provision of the Constitution suggests the Founding Fathers were very comfortable with delegating private power, and did not view that as some kind of great encroachment on the executive branch or the separation of powers. And I find that that is relevant to
I love
events.
that. And that's why I love this podcast. And I wish I'd put that. I'm going to put that in the second edition of the book. But yeah, it was not just that they were comfortable; they needed to do it, or else we would not have a country.
Right. So when Scalia says, again, a little doctrinal, everybody short of me seems to think that Scalia's dissent in the case Morrison versus Olson was his best opinion. Justice Kagan has said that when the court upheld the independent prosecutor statute, Scalia dissented. It was 7-1 and said we should strike this law down. But he begins by saying all the executive power is vested in the president by Article 2. It doesn't say all. That's not what it says. So the great textualist begins, A, with a misquote. But more importantly, all the executive power was not vested in the president, because Congress had the right to authorize private citizens to effectively act as a military.
Right.
Everything he said was wrong. Anyway, okay. So that's one issue. But I love the letter of Marque stuff. Letter of Marque stuff. I'm sorry.
It might be Marque.
And I think a lot of law professors will enjoy that chapter of this book, if nothing else.
Well, hopefully
now more serious
other parts too.
Yes, everybody should read this book. If I've not been clear about that, I laughed out loud the entire time. The Year of Living Constitutionally. Order it; you will not be disappointed. That's why AJ's on my podcast.
Thank you.
I have been yelling for years now, and maybe this is—I don't know if you got it from me or you. I should tell the audience you talked to a number of different, very famous law professors, much more famous than I am, to write this book. So this was a well-researched book. And I'm going to prove it right now, because you talk a lot in this book about a law review article, which I claim is one of the most important law review articles of the last 50 years. There are only about 10 important law review articles of the last 50 years. That isn't saying a lot, but it's one of those 10. And it's an article by Judd Campbell, who's been on my podcast, where he makes the point that everything we know about the First Amendment cannot be traced to the original meaning of the First Amendment. With the exception of prior restraints and licensing schemes, that's not how they thought about free speech. And you talk about this a lot in your book. So tell me about that.
I love this. And I probably did get it from your podcast. He is a brilliant scholar.
Yes, he is.
And his point is that if we go back to the original meaning of many of these texts, no one would like it. Liberals wouldn't like it, but conservatives wouldn't like it either. And the First Amendment is a good example, because they did not see rights as these absolute trump cards. They saw rights as balanced against the common good. Once you make a contract with society, your rights have to be balanced with the general welfare. And this was very clear in the First Amendment. Our First Amendment rights, which I love, are mostly 20th century. They were developed in the 20th century. It was much more constrained. It wasn't quite Stalinist Russia, but they were much more constrained. They had, under the Adams administration, they had sedition laws, which were which Adams considered perfectly constitutional. There was there were obscenity and blasphemy laws on the state level that were not considered unconstitutional because they were concerned about the common good. They were concerned about the order, and they thought that if people started blaspheming, then order would break down. So I actually tried to institute the New York State cursing and blasphemy law in my house because it was for every curse or blaspheme, it was 37.5 cents that you had to pay the government. I had a little jar, and when my kids cursed, I'd say, all right, put 37.5 cents. Of course, they are budding lawyers, so they would say, I don't have a half cent, so I'll just wait till it's 75 cents. Then they would get to 75, they would curse one more time, so it would get back to the half cent. So it was not successful, but it was very interesting to see. Judd talks about, or Professor Campbell talks about how liberals would not like it because it is, there's much less leeway to criticize the government, but conservative things like the now my lack of going to law school is showing up.
It's okay.
The laws about campaign finance.
Yes, finance reform.
Right.
Citizens United
Citizens
plus 10
United.
other cases.
That's what thank you.
Yeah.
So yes, the Citizens United the founders would probably be
shocked.
Yeah, they would, because they were very anti-corruption.
And by the way, speaking of Citizens United, you gave me an opportunity to chime in here since we're talking about originalism, and this is Originalism Month on Supreme Myths. In Citizens United itself, Justice Stevens made the argument that corporations had no rights at the founding. They only had they had rights, but only if the state gave them rights in the charter. They had no other rights other than what the state said corporations had. Now, we would not want that today, because I don't want the government violating the New York Times' or your, as an author, Fourth Amendment rights. If you have no rights, they can come in your house and just, take all your books away, and we don't want that. But Scalia's response in Citizens United to Stevens' argument that this case is wrong because corporations don't have these kind of rights, Scalia's response was, that may have been true at the founding, but the corporation form has changed so much that we have to have different rules. Yes. So for those of you who can't, this isn't on YouTube yet, AJ just did a big look at me like, whoa, Scalia said that?
Yeah.
Yes, Scalia said that. He said corporations are different today, so the rules have to be different today, which he said a lot if originalism didn't support his views.
Right. But he did not say it about the Second Amendment, for instance.
Yeah, or gay rights or abortion or any of those things. Right. That's right. The thing about Judd Campbell that you raised in your book that I want to talk about just for 5 more minutes, because I literally on a regular basis get unbelievably depressed by New York City by the Bruen case from 2022, the gun case where the court struck down a 1911 New York law about carrying guns in public. But what I hate about that case is Justice Thomas's bizarre restatement of constitutional law that now we're not going to balance it. You said at the founding, what they thought about was what is the right, what is the public interest, and how do we balance those two things? And you're exactly right. Everybody thought that way. In the name of originalism, in the name of history, and in the name of tradition, Justice Thomas tells us in Bruen, judges can't do that. No more balancing the public interest against whatever the rationale for the law was. It's a strictly historical test. A strictly historical test, which no one in history would ever have said is the right test.
Well, yes, that's the point that Campbell and also Jonathan Knapp, who I believe he's not on, he's a great, and their point is the originalism we have today is deeply unoriginal in so many ways. One is the balancing of those, and the Supreme Court itself is deeply unoriginal. So, and I also think an argument can be made that not all of them, and it depended on where they were in their careers, but many of the Founding Fathers were profoundly entrepreneurial and flexible thinkers, and that they would never be caught being just thinking about the original meaning and not thinking about the consequences or looking at it from multiple angles.
Yes, that's not how it's just not how they thought about law. And Judd and also Saul Cornell, you talked to
Yeah.
also. I mean, Judd is a law professor with a great historical talent. Jonathan Gannap is a historian. Saul Cornell is an historian. And he would say that everything that you and Judd are saying and I'm saying about this is correct. That it was all about the balancing of rights against the public good. And for the most originalist court in American history, which is not saying much because it's not an originalist court, to issue a decision that is that anti-originalist is really it's almost more than I can bear. All right, I want to ask you a very important question about cruel and unusual punishment, because you are more of an expert on this subject than most law professors and lawyers, because you yourself actually discovered that back at the founding, the pillory was a legal way to punish people. So you decided you wanted to experience that. So tell that story.
Well, right. I mean, that is just another example of how much the meaning of words have changed. Cruel and unusual in the 1780s. The pillory, which is that wooden thing you put your arms in and your head in, that was not considered cruel or unusual. And John Jay sentenced one spy to the pillory. And I thought, okay, well, and actually Scalia, in his famous article about originalism, The Lesser of Two Evils, he says a truly committed originalist would swallow the bitter pill and say, you know what? Since it was not cruel and unusual then, it's still protected by
flogging. He was talking about flogging,
right? So I was like, all right.
I'm sorry, but I need to tell the audience he did walk that back years. He walked that back years later. Right. So that's the famous article where Scalia called himself a faint-hearted originalist.
Exactly.
A couple years after that, when asked a crazy question about flogging, he said, "I'm an originalist, but I'm not a nut," referring to Clarence Thomas.
Right.
That's exactly what happened. But then, as he was getting older, and I think losing it a little bit, he gave an interview to not New Yorker, but New York Magazine, where he said many amazing things. One of which was, no, I was wrong in that Cincinnati Law Review article, the Taft lecture. I am not a faint-hearted originalist. I am a real originalist. And no, I'd have to uphold flogging today. That's what he said. He also said he believes in the devil, doesn't everybody. But leaving that aside.
Interesting.
So you went in the pillory.
Yes, the pillory,
yes.
Which, by the way, was not a joke. Like you were in there for an hour, and it wasn't just throwing rotten vegetables. Like, you had the worst stuff, dead animals. People were pelting you with rocks. It was horrible. But I thought, okay, if I'm going to explore this, let me get a pillory and see what happens. And you can find them on Etsy. They are more geared towards adult entertainment than they are towards punishment. But I did find one, and actually, it was very custom made. So they ask, how big are your wrists, and do you want any padding around the neck area? Which I thought was, if you're going to buy a pillory.
Wait a minute, hold on, back up, stop. Are you suggesting? I didn't get this from reading the book, that there is a market for pillories out here in America?
Oh, yeah. Well, it is, yes, a certain type of adult entertainment, people, and I'm not kink shaming. If people like that, I'm fine with it.
Yeah, I'm not kink shaming either. I just think that's an interesting digression for this podcast to take, but fine, go ahead, continue.
So I bought it. My original plan was like, well, maybe I'll give my kids a choice. Instead of no screens for a day, they can have 5 minutes. But even I was too faint-hearted for that. So the only one I could put in the pillory was myself. And I didn't trust my kids, so I had my wife do it, and she locked it. And it was weird. I mean, I was laughing at the start, but then I started to feel a little uncomfortable and powerless. And then, of course, my wife was like, "I'll let you out if you fold your sweaters," that kind of thing. But I did finally get out. But that stunt, and it was a bit of a stunt, was just to show how much change the words meaning has changed in 200 years.
Actually, I hadn't thought about this when I read this part of your book. I don't know if the Supreme Court would hold that time in a pillory is cruel and unusual punishment.
Interesting.
I mean, they probably would, but I'm not positive. Look, these lethal again, to be serious for 1 minute, these lethal injections are torturous. I mean, they are torturous. People are drowning. It's like being drowned and being burned alive or whatever. That's not cruel and unusual punishment. So it's hard to imagine if that's not cruel and unusual punishment. Why would a pillory be cruel and unusual? 10 minutes in the pillory. I don't know. It does tell you crazy things. You said you didn't trust your kids. I unequivocally would never go into a pillory and hand the keys to my teenage girls. There's no way. There is no. I think they would blackmail me to get me out. Your wife, however, was amenable to letting you out, I take it?
She eventually let me out. I had to promise to fold the sweaters.
I think I would have added some demands to that, but I'm not sure.
Well, I still have it, and I'm not using it. So if you want it for your family, I'm happy to send it.
What was harder, living biblically or living originally, constitutionally?
They were both huge challenges. I mean, the Bible, I think my wife disliked more because I had to grow this huge beard and she wouldn't kiss me for 7 months.
My wife hates beards too. It's a real problem.
There you go. But they were both incredibly challenging. I mean, even just finding, the Third Amendment, of course, says that you don't have to house soldiers, quarter soldiers without your consent. But I figured it would be a nice thing to do and give consent. It's sort of a very Federalist era hospitality. But it was very hard to find a soldier who was willing to quarter. So that I got rejected by all sorts of soldiers in Times Square, and I finally found a friend of a friend. So they were both very challenging. But I also want to stress, part of the book is trying to look at what is how we should interpret the Constitution. How much flexibility should we build in? And I'm more on your side, of course. But also part was, is there any wisdom from the 18th century that is worth revisiting? And certainly not everything. It was, as we said, sexist, racist, smelly, dangerous time. But they also had this idea of self-sacrifice for the common good. They had this idea of slow thinking, that writing with a quill slows down your thoughts, of controlling your rage. And in this day of rage to engage or engage to rage, we need some more self-governance of our anger, I think. So there are parts of the 18th century mindset that I do think are valuable, and we don't want to go back, as I said. So
what's fascinating, you just mentioned the phrase common good like 4 times, I think, in the last 45 minutes, give or take. And I got to digress a little bit because, and again, everybody listen, this book, The Year of Living Constitutionally, it is entertaining, it is funny, and it is smart. So I cannot recommend it enough for people. But what I want to say is, there's this huge debate going on right now, mostly in limited to legal academia. So no one really cares. But it's a huge debate inside legal academia about a guy at Harvard Law School named Adrian Vermeule, who wrote a book called Common Good Constitutionalism. Now, Adrian's vision of common good, and this is a Harvard law professor, of common good constitutionalism, his vision of that is pretty awful to all liberals, because he's anti-choice, he's anti-LGBTQ rights and all that stuff. But he's also one of the best critics of originalism. And I've gotten in trouble because I've praised his critique of originalism while criticizing almost everything else he does. But here's the point I want to make, since you keep talking about the common good. Originalists hate his work. They do. But as a matter of procedure, not substance, but that's the wrong way to put that. It turns out that Adrian is probably closer to the original meaning of what 1791 was like than any originalist today. And yet originalists despise his work.
That is fascinating. Yeah, and
I thought so too.
I don't like his vision of what the common good is. But I do agree, I think, with his assessment that back then they were very interested in balancing your individual rights with your responsibility. We don't have a Bill of Responsibilities in the Constitution, but I think that's partly because they assumed it was so accepted that you would sacrifice for your community, your country. Whether that's the bucket brigade and putting out fires, everyone's a firefighter, or it's being in the militia. And I don't want mandatory military service, but I do like the idea of many countries having, even if it's just 2 weeks or a month where you have to do something like AmeriCorps. I think that would remind people of their responsibility. It would provide a glue that we desperately need for this country. Uh, so yes, I am, and it's more originalist in that sense of the that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think, and by the way, of course, the founding fathers would have loved the idea of universal service of some kind.
Yeah,
They wouldn't
absolutely.
have. They did not make Quakers, go to war, but they did require some kind of government service. I agree with you. I think that's a really good idea. All right. So after I read your book, and laughed, and then looked you up and saw your picture and saw a couple of videos you did, I was trying to decide who would play you in the movie. And I think I know the answer. So my audience can't see you. Someday this will be on YouTube, but not this week. But I think Adam Sandler. What do you think?
I would be honored. I am an
Yes.
Adam Sandler fan. I wonder what his views are on
Yes.
the Constitution. I'd be
I'm
interested.
not an Adam Sandler fan, other than my best friend once saw him on the beach and said he was a really nice guy.
That is
But I
nice.
think I think you guys have. I think he would be. I think he'd be you. All right. I want to. We only have 5 minutes left, but I want to change subject. So I want to repeat. The book is The Year of Living Constitutionally. It is a book that the most sophisticated law professors and people who know nothing about the law or originalism can appreciate, and everybody in between. It
Bless
is
you.
really the thing I liked the most about it was how universally accessible it was, even when you went into topic like Judd Campbell's law review articles, which you wouldn't expect, necessarily to see in this kind of book. But you handled all that really well.
That is
So
huge,
congratulations to you.
huge
Um,
compliment. Thank you.
well, you did. Well, you did. Um, I found out something about you unrelated to this book that I found fascinating, and that is this kayaking trip that you
That's
and your
true.
sister had. I didn't tell you I was going to raise this. I
No,
apologize, but I'm dying to hear the end of the story. So go ahead. Can you do this in about 5 minutes? I have about 5 minutes left. Can you do it in 5 minutes?
sure, sure. So this was
Go,
when I was a
go.
teenager. My sister and I were a teenager, and our family took a trip to Alaska. And my sister and I rented a kayak and went out paddling in Glacier Bay National Park, one of the largest parks, millions of acres. And we turned around after half an hour, and we were completely lost. We were literally at sea.
Ugh.
And
How old were you?
I would have been probably about 15. Um,
Wow. Okay.
and so we kept paddling and paddling. It got colder, it got darker, and we didn't want to go on land because we had heard there were bears. And we were told later that if we'd kept going, we probably would have been swept out to sea. And that
Wow.
would be it. But we got super lucky. One of the only other campers in the entire park happened to be drunk at like 1 in the morning and making a lot of noise. So we heard them. We started screaming.
Hold on. You were on the water at 1 in the morning.
Oh yeah, we paddled the whole until from like
Wow.
3 until 1, and we screamed. They came out and rescued us. And this little moment of kindness literally saved our lives. So I told this story to my son, and he knows that I'm huge into gratitude. I wrote a book on trying to thank 1,000 people who had anything to do with my morning cup of coffee. And he said, well, why aren't you trying to find this person and thank them? And I was like, oh, that's a nice idea. So I did. I spent all this time. I got the report, the police report, and I got the name of the guy, Doug Rand. And
Wow.
I was in touch with like 100 Doug Rands. None of them are the right Doug Rand. I met some lovely
Oh
Doug
no.
Rands, including one who worked in the Obama administration. So I wrote about it for the New York Times, hoping that it would flush out the correct Doug Rand. I still have not found him. And
Oh.
so if he's listening, if he happens to be a fan of the Constitution, please contact me. I want to thank you for this super generous. But even if I don't thank him, I just love the idea that there is sometimes the kindness of strangers, and we live in a world where we're bombarded with negativity from the moment we wake up until the moment. And it's not always negative. There are moments of humans can be wonderful.
So I confess that I was a little manipulative there. I wanted you to tell that story so people listening to this can see what a great storyteller you are, because you didn't know I was going to ask you that question. And so I tell my students, you might find this interesting. I tell my law students, every time a partner, a client, or a judge asks you a question, you should say exactly what you mean in as few words as possible and have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you can do that, you will be a able articulator of ideas. If every answer has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you tell a story, no matter how short the sentence, and your book is wonderful because it tells stories that way. It is really a series of vignettes, related.
Thank you.
Vignettes. And they have beginning, that they have arcs,
Right.
And frankly, lawyers who have to answer questions from judges and clients should tell stories with arcs. It's an effective way of communication, and you do it very well. So everybody, go and buy The Year of Living Constitutionally. It is very funny. You will have to pay in $2024, not $1791.
That's true.
But it will be worth it. And you can read about pillories and letters of marques or marquise, however they pronounced it, and also come away, and this is my ulterior motive, with a healthy skepticism about our ability to recreate the past, which I assume, last question, was actually the main point of this book.
That's exactly, well, one of the main points, but certainly, yes. The idea is that when we are looking at the Constitution, original meaning should play a part, but I am a fan of multiple lenses, so I like the idea of, as were the original founding fathers, so look at the consequences, look at how it affects our descendants, look at how it affects the reputation of the court even. And all of these things can play a part. So I am much more a fox than a hedgehog, to use Isaiah Berlin's. But thank you for your kind words. And also, as I said this earlier, you had a huge influence on this book.
Well, okay.
So thank you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thanks for coming on. And I want to have you on when you write your next book, The Year of Living Under a Dictator, which hopefully,
I really
which hopefully you won't
want to write.
Well, here's the funny thing, and you won't be able to.
Good. Good point.
Because they'll censor it. Thank you so much, AJ. This was really fun.
Thank you, Eric. A joy.